Um, my name is Tom Pike, and I was for many years the minister here, and I know some stories. It's a risk. I don't want to bore you, but I want to tell you some stories, especially about Mr. Burleigh, because he was a great man, a terrific man in the life of this city and in the life of this country. He was such a terrific musician, but you know, the good old days are not so good when you examine them. And Mr. Burleigh had a hard time in this city. And this is a historic church. It's on the National Registry of Historic Places, because wonderful things have happened here, and some tough things have happened here. And some very interesting people have worshipped here, sat where you're sitting now. Henry Bacon, who designed the Lincoln Memorial, was here and as an architect, and many other people, including J.P. Morgan. The end of the 19th century, the rector, Dr. Rainsford, wanted to increase the size of the choir, and he had an audition program, and they began auditioning people, and Mr. Burleigh applied for the job. And now it's hard maybe for you to think about this. It's even hard to say it. But in those days, no big church, this was the largest church in Manhattan at one time, no large church had anybody of color in the choir. And the choir was entirely white, and they began interviewing people, and it was clear that Harry Burleigh was so much better than anybody they interviewed. And the rector listened to the people, and he told Mr. Morgan, and finally he began to talk to people in the church, and they said the whole choir will resign if you get an African American singing in the choir. And so the rector talked to Mr. Morgan, and Morgan was very clear. He said, "Who was the best person?" And the rector said, "Mr. Burleigh was the best one." And Mr. Morgan said, "Hire the best person, always, that's the principle. The person who has the most talent, who has the highest quality, hire that man." So the rector decided he would hire Mr. Burleigh, and then he got lots of feedback. And in those days, the vestry, the trustees of this church met in Mr. Morgan's library, and Mr. Morgan would preside at the meetings, and there was a night, an incredible night, when the rector, Dr. Rainsford, poured out his heart. He said, "I've interviewed lots of people, and the best person for this job is Mr. Harry Burleigh." And so Mr. Morgan said, "Okay, we'll go around the circle." The vestry were all there, and they went around the circle. Everybody was against it. One by one, they said, "No, you can't have that. You can't do that. You can't hire this man." We got back to Mr. Morgan, and Mr. Morgan looked at the rector and he said, "While we've been talking, I've been tabulating their pledges. I will make up the difference. Hire the man. Hire the man." And they hired Harry Burleigh, and he came, and the first Sunday he was here at St. George's Church. They had a choir of 40 people. And they met downstairs to come into the church. The church was filled with people. And the idea was that they would, as they always did, walk down the aisle, the choir singing, and the rector at the end of the line. They got to the door here, and everybody in the choir said, "We're not going to walk in with that man." They said they would not walk down the aisle with Harry Burleigh. And so there was a moment at that door when the rector said to Mr. Burleigh, "The two of us will walk down the aisle together." And they walked down the aisle, and the congregation was singing the hymn, looking for the choir, which was not to be seen. The two men walked right down the aisle and took their place up here. And Mr. Burleigh sang a solo, and within 3 weeks, the choir was back. But his life was not easy. Harry Burleigh's life was not easy in this city. He became very popular. People used to come to church just to hear Mr. Burleigh sing. And he worked with Anton Dvorak on the New World Symphony, as I said, and he was a highly regarded man. So highly regarded that Theodore Roosevelt invited him to come to the Executive Mansion in Albany to sing for a little concert in the Executive Mansion. And when the evening was over, the staff, the governor's staff, discovered something very unpleasant. They could not find a hotel in the city of Albany that would accept Mr. Burleigh as a guest. And so they came to speak to the governor and said, "Mr. Roosevelt, we have a problem. There's no hotel in Albany that will accept Mr. Burleigh." And so to Theodore Roosevelt's credit, he said, "Put him in the VIP room." And that's where he spent the night in Albany, as an honored guest of the state of New York. So when we think of Harry Burleigh, think of a great musician. Think of a man of tremendous courage. He had a great mother who he learned his first bit about music by being bundled up on winter nights when his mother was working as a servant in a big house in Erie, Pennsylvania, and she would arrange it so that she could open the window a little bit and put her son Harry out in the garden with the shrubbery, and he would put his ear to the window and listen to the music in this big house. And that's where he first learned about great classical music. The songs that we're singing today, he learned from his grandfather, who was a lamplighter in the city of Erie. And he would go from lamp to lamp with his grandfather, who he loved very much. And his grandfather would teach him these great songs. And he remembered them all of his life. And so when you think of Harry Burleigh, think of a great musician. But think of a man who is part of the American experience. It was not always easy. But there are people, even in this church today, because I know some of them, who remember him when he was here. And what you would say about Mr. Burleigh is he was such a gentleman. He was an old world kind of guy. He was through the worst that the American society can throw at a person. But he never became depressed by it. He became a man of great character and great ability, and he had wonderful friends. He was invited by Mr. Morgan every Christmas Eve to come and sing Christmas carols at the house, and when Mr. Morgan died, Harry Burleigh stood up here and sang at his memorial service. So there was healing and there was strength in Mr. Burleigh, and he is an inspiration to lots of people. Toward the end of his life, he lived in a convalescent home in Stamford, Connecticut. And the story is told that he loved music so much that the choir from Morehouse College used to come and serenade him once a year. And when the choir came to sing at the convalescent home just for Mr. Burleigh, he would get up out of his wheelchair and stand as they sang, out of respect. Can I suggest that maybe you might consider, when we continue this program, standing up out of respect for Mr. Burleigh as we continue to sing these songs? Remember, they speak of a great journey, a journey of faith and hope, and some of us experience that personally, as Mr. Burleigh did. Others have a general feeling about it, and since I'm a minister, you would not expect me to stand up here and not read from the Bible. I'm going to do that. So I want to read to you something from Exodus. These words and this spirit inspired Mr. Burleigh so much in his life. When Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the peoples of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of the cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power of the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. I want to just conclude by saying I heard this read at the Union Seminary, and a friend of mine, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, heard it with me, and he stood up and he said, "Now, whenever I hear this, I am reminded of a teaching by the rabbis. They tell the story that God looked down on the destruction of the Egyptians, and the angels began to sing songs of praise and jubilation, and God looked at them and said, 'How can you sing when my children, the Egyptians, are dying?'" So that there is something powerful in this music today, and I'm so glad to be part of it with you. God bless you.